Welcome back. Here we go. What we're going to start with now is how do we produce movement? What is the simplest outline of events? We think of a movement that we want to make. Let's say I want to reach down and pick up this paintbrush. I think of it, but imagine all the things that happen. Those neural signals are sent down my spinal cord, out through peripheral nerves, into muscles. Muscles have to be coordinated perfectly to get my hand to the right position and coordinate my fingers to grasp and reach it up and begin to conduct the orchestra. So that is the simplest outline of events. There's feedback, of course, when I make an error, or if I use vision, I have multiple sensory systems coming into play. But we can try to outline that simple set of events in this following flow chart. How do we produce movement? It begins, of course, with a neural command here. So that neural command leaves the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, and flows out to muscles. We then have a process called muscle tendon dynamics, and those muscles produce forces. They act on the skeletal geometric system, and then they produce moments about the joints. The skeletal dynamics produces a set of accelerations, and over time these are integrated to produce movement, the velocities and angles. Now, we are equipped with sensors in our body that sense our position, forces in muscles and other things, and that feeds back into neural command. So we're going to study all of these components in the class. So one of the things that we'll do in Chapter 4 is we'll study the biology and structure of muscle. We will study how the molecular motors, actin and myosin, interact to produce forces and how those add up to very large forces in muscles. We'll also, in Lecture 5 and Chapter 5, develop engineering models of muscle that can estimate the forces in muscles. So here we'll develop this engineering model, we'll specify a contractile element, a passive element, mechanical properties of tendon, and from that we'll be able to compute what muscle forces are. This is one of the most important things we do in biomechanics because muscle forces actuate movement. We want to know what those forces are. Also because muscle forces are the main contributors to forces in joints like the knee. I showed you the X-ray last time. We want to be able to estimate muscle forces. So we make this calculation about neural command to muscle force in basically two ways. One is to use EMG and muscle models. So EMG is an electromyogram. We can put sensors on muscles or in muscles and sense when they're on and how much they're on. And then with a muscle model, like I showed you briefly, you can estimate how big those muscle forces are. And we'll cover that, as I said, in Chapters 4 and Chapter 5. We can also estimate the neural command using optimization analysis. This is a mathematical technique that assumes that we're optimizing something. When I walk, I might be minimizing metabolic energy. When I reach, I might be optimizing the trade-off between speed and accuracy. And we can use optimization methods that we cover in Chapter 9 in the book and the associated lectures to estimate neural command and muscle forces in that way. Okay, so we'll also move on and talk about musculoskeletal geometry. Muscles don't act in isolation. They act at lever arms with respect to joint centers. And in Chapter 6, we'll cover musculoskeletal geometry and also with the associated lectures. Multibody dynamics is a broad field of study in mechanics, and it plays an essential role and central role in movement biomechanics. So we will cover that in a number of lectures and a number of chapters. Tom Yoshida will give most of the lectures related to skeletal dynamics. Now, when forces are applied to a dynamic system, they produce a set of accelerations that you can see here. Those accelerations are integrated over time to produce changes in body position. We won't cover the details of integration methods in this course. There are other courses in numerical methods, and you can use our simulation software to perform these integrations, but I want you to know that that's what's happening. So we call this forward dynamics, and that is the flow of events that happen in production of movement. We call it forward because the forces are causing motions. But we also use a process called inverse dynamics. And in inverse dynamics, the broad picture is that we measure a motion and then we go backwards to induce what the forces must have been to produce that motion. We'll also cover inverse dynamics in this approach. Experimental methods for measuring motion and forces are an essential part of this. This is a very common problem, and this first step in inverse dynamics is called inverse kinematics. So here we make measurements of motion of body segments, and from those measurements we figure out what the positions are of these body segments and what the joint angles are. By solving a problem called inverse kinematics, we compute the joint angles, and then by differentiating those joint angles, we figure out the velocities and accelerations. We then use inverse dynamics to figure out the moments and optimization to estimate muscle forces. So you can see we're moving in the opposite direction as we did in the forward dynamic process. So to get from kinematic angles, it's one of the most common problems in biomechanics. It's covered in the lectures associated with Chapter 7 and in several of the homework problems that I'll tell you about as well. In many instances, we'll cover it in the lecture, we'll cover it in the book, but then we have an associated website that has homework problems that will be very helpful as well. So filtering and differentiation is important. When we do inverse dynamics, we frequently measure the angles. But for the dynamical equations, we need to know velocities and accelerations. Velocities are the first derivative of the joint angles, and accelerations, angular accelerations, are the second derivative of the joint angles. So we need to differentiate to get the quantities we need for inverse dynamics. And to do that, we can end up with a noisy signal. We'll talk a little bit about that in our inverse dynamics lectures. Multibody dynamics, I mentioned, is central to all of biomechanics. You'll learn to solve these equations by hand in some simple homework problems, and we will cover it in lecture. And you also use OpenSim to do this for more complex realistic systems. And finally, to estimate muscle forces, we'll introduce you to optimization theory. That, again, is a mathematical technique for estimating the optimal pattern of coordination of muscles to produce a particular motion. So there we have it, forward dynamics and inverse dynamics. In forward dynamics, we start here with a neural command and move forward through the process along the lines of how movement is really produced. Inverse dynamics, we start with measurements here and we flow along this direction until we end up with calculating what the forces must have been to produce the movement. So a lot of this course is organized around forward dynamics and inverse dynamics, and you can see the organization of the course and the book in this one picture. I'll take you through the various parts, part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4. So let's zoom in just on part 1. We're going to start by just talking about locomotion. Key for humans is walking and running. Those will be chapters 2 and 3, and the set of lectures associated with that. Part 2 is how we produce movement. That's this forward dynamic process. We'll talk about muscle biology, muscle modeling, and musculoskeletal geometry. You see that in chapters 4, 5, and 6. Now, there are lectures associated with all of these individual chapters. Part 3 is analysis of movement in chapters 7, 8, and 9. And that's where we do inverse kinematics to calculate joint angles, inverse dynamics to calculate joint moments, and optimization to calculate muscle forces. We'll conclude the book with part 4, where we return to walking and running, but this time with much deeper insight. We'll do chapter 10 on how we develop muscle-driven models, muscle-driven simulations of motion. And Chapter 11 will deal with muscle-driven walking, Chapter 12, muscle-driven running. I'll then point you to, in Chapter 13, not shown here, where the field of biomechanics is headed in the future. So that's the plan. We've talked about why we study movement, how we produce movement, and what's in the course. What I want to do now is just transition to tell you a little bit about how to get the most out of the course. See you there.